The Australian Financial Review.
It was the federal budget we weren't meant to have. Scheduled for next Tuesday, the expectation was that the election would have been called by now and the budget cancelled. But then Cyclone Alfred got in the way.
It's all about the election now and whether it's going to be called or not, but then we've got this plot twist. With the cyclone, how much is it going to change things?
Now the budget is back on, whether the Albanese government wanted it or not.
The reason they did not want to do a budget was because it's going to confirm that we're back in deficit for 10 years, that the debt is still around $1 trillion. There's not a lot of good news in it.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, political editor Philip Curry and economics editor John Keogh on how both sides of politics are planning to spin the budget, who's ahead in the polls, and why the most important person in this election race might not be Anthony Albanese or Peter Dutton. It's Thursday, March 20. Hi, Phil. Hi, John. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Welcome, Lise.
Yeah, great to be with you.
Phil, we're in this limbo period. We're in the middle of an election campaign that's not an official election campaign, but the race is on. The Financial Review had its latest poll out on Monday. What did it tell us?
What did it tell us? It told us that we're still looking at a hung parliament, Lisa, that the Liberal Party or the Coalition's primary vote is about 39%, the Labor's is 31%. On a two-party preferred basis, that gives the Coalition a lead of 51 to 49, but given they have so few seats, they're starting with 57 out of 150. Even if that happened on the day and that swing towards them was universal, they'd still only finish with about 66 or 67 seats, whereas Labor would be in the low 70s, so Labor would be in a much better position to form a minority government. And that really hasn't changed, minus a percentage point here or there for months now. But the key takeout from Monday's poll is this sort of drop-off in Peter Dutton's rating. So he's taken a hit as his approval rating's fallen for another 4 points. So he's dropped 8 points in terms of net approval in 2 months now. Albanese has opened up a lead for the first time since October as preferred Prime Minister. Dutton's preference as the leader to deal with Donald Trump has been diminished. And I think most significantly is we track expectations. So it's not who you're going to vote for, it's who do you think will win. And this sort of craziness took hold back in December last year that, the Liberal Party had this in the bag. We'd seen this in the betting markets and in questions such as the one we asked. And that expectation has now taken a big hit in the last month. And it's, the Libs were leading that about 50-37. It's now about 45-42. So people are recalibrating their expectations as well.
And Phil, next week, the government is releasing its pre-election budget. No one expected this to actually happen, but it's happening. Explain why Treasury is now scrambling to get its numbers together.
Well, essentially, Lisa, we weren't expecting this budget because the government had no intention of handing it down. Before Cyclone Alfred came along, the government had settled on an election for April 12.
It's all about the election now and whether it's going to be called or not, but then we've got this plot twist.
Forced by the weather, the March 25 budget back on.
My sole focus is not calling an election. My sole focus is on the needs of Australians.
He decided to be impolitic to call an election while there's still some homes being flooded and so forth. So what it did, it forced the Prime Minister to delay the election until May 3rd at the earliest, because he couldn't have gone the 17th of April because that's Easter and the 25th is Anzac Day, so the next possible date was May 3. And the upshot of that was he had to deliver the budget as scheduled on 25th of March, which they didn't really want to do. So when you talk in your introduction about this sort of weird period we're in at the moment, it very much is one of recalibration. Well, they've sort of pulled the budget out of the bin and, dusted it off and trying to make it now a document that will augment their election prospects rather than detract from them. And the reason they did not want to do a budget was because it's going to confirm that we're back in deficit for 10 years, that the debt is still around $1 trillion. There's not a lot of good news in it. And look, one of the consequences of this last-minute shift in election timing is, and as the Treasurer is admitting in a speech this week, is they've announced most of their policies because they thought would be 1 week or into the second week of the campaign by now. And because of the preponderance of pre-poll voting, most people tend to vote before election day, they actually had announced nearly everything before last Sunday when they were going to call the election. And the Treasurer's admitting that there's a couple of things left, but you won't see much of that on budget day because they want to save what's left for the campaign itself, which will start sometime after the budget is handed down. So it's going to be a fairly pedestrian document next week, not much more than an economic statement. So notwithstanding the fact that the government didn't want to release a budget because of the economic story it was going to tell, now that the fact that they have to release one does give them a chance, I guess, to recalibrate and put a bit of polish on it and tell a story they think will be favourable.
So, John, pedestrian document it might be on Phil's assessment, but we are having this budget and it's an opportunity for the government to set up its economic narrative, or as Treasurer Jim Chalmers says, to tell its economic story to voters. What is that story?
Well, Jim Chalmers, the Labor government, they're going to be trying to tell voters, convince people that the economy has turned a corner. We've gone through a rough period over the last couple of years with inflation, but that's now moderating. Interest rates are starting to ease after that Reserve Bank interest rate cut in February, and that real wages are now starting to pick up because there's been a big hit to real household incomes, disposable incomes, about 8% or so from the highs during the COVID period. Labor's going to be saying, look, the outlook's better, stick with us. The economy's gone through this difficult period, but now there's some green shoots starting to emerge. And so that's going to be their key message, I believe. The coalition is going to be focusing more in their response on, well, but people are still experiencing high prices relative to 2 or 3 years ago. Real household disposable incomes are still lower as well. And so you're going to get a bit of a face-off between Jim Chalmers vis-a-vis Peter Dutton and Angus Taylor. Chalmers, this is his opportunity to really be at the centre of the fight, the limelight, with his budget delivery speech. He is the government's best economic communicator. He knows how to deliver a message, so he'll be trying to be the chief advocate and proponent for the government about getting re-elected based on where the economy could be heading under Labor. But obviously Dutton and Taylor and their responses will be countering that with the pain people have been feeling in their household budgets that, yeah, sure, things might be getting a little bit better, but they're still a long way behind where we were previously.
And how did the Treasurer and Shadow Treasurer match up?
Well, Chalmers is a good retail communicator in the media. He's up against Angus Taylor, and that's probably not his core competency or strength. But Taylor, ironically, he's sort of one of the best people qualified to be Treasurer, at least on paper and according to his CV. He won the University Model at Economics at Sydney University. Now, that's the sort of thing that Reserve Bank governors and top economists win in the private sector and Treasury, those sorts of places. He did a Masters of Economics at Oxford in the UK. He was a Rhodes Scholar there, I think. And he was a McKinsey partner too. So on paper, he's got all the sort of prowess. He understands economics, but he probably hasn't cut through as much as Chalmers does in the retail politics communication in the media. And that's probably the contrast between the two.
So, John, both sides will have their prepared lines on the economy. But what's the real story? How is the economy tracking?
Look, I think the economy is held up at a macroeconomic aggregate level reasonably well, given we've had more than 4 percentage points of interest rate rise. We've had this inflation battle. Unemployment's still low, around 4% or so. If you had have said to people at the start of this sort of rate rising cycle that was going to be the outcome at an aggregate level, I think they'd say that's reasonably good. But it's at the household individual finance level where people have felt the pain because there's been no real productivity growth in the economy, which means wage rises in real terms haven't really been able to be paid sustainably. Obviously, people have felt the pain of the rate rises, the inflation, all those sorts of things as well. So there's a disconnect between the macroeconomic figures and actual people's personal household finances. Chalmers will be able to point to he's had 2 surpluses, but going forward, there's going to be potentially 4 to 10 years of deficit. So that's not necessarily a great story to tell either.
Phil, Labor has this platform to tell its economic story, but Peter Dutton will also have a platform in his budget reply speech. How do you think he will use it? He's had a difficult few weeks. Is this an opportunity for him to take back the momentum?
Yes, in short, but one event alone is not going to be sufficient. It does afford Dutton a nationally televised address, prime time, 7 o'clock. When he stands up in response to the budget in the House of Representatives, and that's always traditionally probably the best opportunity an opposition leader gets every year to talk to the nation, and no more important than, 5 minutes before an election. It's even more important, Lisa, because he's had an average last couple of weeks, probably two of the rougher weeks of his leadership.
On Tuesday, the Liberal leader attended a party fundraising lunch in Sydney just hours after receiving a briefing on the cyclone.
There's the Justin Hemmings fundraising incident, that 2 days before this cyclone was supposed to hit his electorate, he scarpered off to Sydney for a whistle-stop trip to go to Hemmings' mansion for a fundraiser where everyone else was filling sandbags.
It wasn't a party, it was a fundraising dinner, and the Prime Minister and I are doing them around the country at the moment.
As it transpired, we now know that the Prime Minister also went to a fundraiser that night. Labor's embarked on a deliberate campaign to carpet bomb him personally. So they put this thing out a couple of weeks ago that he'd supposedly engaged in some dodgy share buys.
Earlier this week, News.com reported that Peter Dutton bought shares in several big banks shortly before the Labor government announced a major funding boost for the banks in 2009.
Dutton says he never indulged in any insider trading, sort of stakes his reputation as a copper on that.
I've invested, and I think a lot of astute investors would have been buying bank shares at that time because they saw value in the shares.
And I think one of the problems is that the coalition's been very lazy, I think, in trying to define Dutton. If I could just digress, Dutton's pretty much a blank canvas, and Labor's spent the last couple of months filling that canvas in rather than the Liberal Party, and that contributes to the situation he's in at the moment. They're not out to win this election on policy, but that has become a problem because they don't have a lot to talk about. And when they do delve into the policy domain, they just can't seem to get their line straight on whether they intend to forcibly divest insurance companies as well as supermarkets and hardware chains. Dutton's obviously a lot more forward-leaning on that than his shadow ministers like Angus Taylor and Susan Lee. It's just been a scrappy couple of weeks, and you can't afford to be scrappy this close to election.
Yeah, there has been mixed messages coming out of the coalition on the breakup of big oligopoly sectors in the Australian economy.
As we've done with the supermarkets, where we have threatened divestment if consumers are being ripped off, similarly in the insurance market, we will intervene.
We do not propose divestiture with respect to insurance companies, and we've made that clear.
Officially, their policy has been to give the powers to the regulator to potentially break up supermarkets and hardware chains like Bunnings if they deem that there's too much concentration, not enough competition in that sector. But Dutton threatened to expand that sort of power to the big insurance companies as well. So the coalition, they kind of are funnily attracted to these kind of policies. They're not the same sort of traditional Liberal Party of the big business sector that they might have been a generation ago or so under John Howard and Peter Costello.
I guess one of the other new dynamics in this campaign, Lisa, which we haven't seen before, is the influence of Donald Trump. And the association of Dutton with Trump has gone from being a mild positive to, I would argue, now a negative.
Phil, we're talking about the pre-election budget and how it fits into the upcoming campaign. US President Donald Trump is looming large over this election, and it's an association that some thought initially might help Dutton. But amid the chaos in the US in recent weeks, it's starting to hurt him. How significant do you think the Trump impact will be?
Well, given it's so volatile at the moment, Lisa, it's easy to give an answer now, but what it's going to be like in 7 or 8 weeks when we vote, I'm not sure. But we polled back in December last year, and Dutton was overwhelmingly favoured by voters over Albanese as the best person to deal with Donald Trump. And then there was a secondary benefit insofar as the areas of crossover that Dutton had with Trump, sort of basic conservative stuff, illegal immigration, the anti-wokeism, which appeals to, I would argue, a silent majority in Australia, was benefiting Dutton. At the same time, Dutton was always uncomfortable with that association, and that's why he wouldn't do things like walk away from the Paris Climate Accords like is being urged to do by the right wing, or talk about transgender or abortion. Dutton won't go there. But try as you might, that association tends to stick. His detractors out there call him Timu Trump on social media, and now Trump has definitely become a negative on the world. I mean, apart from a handful of commentators who backed him in and are too proud to admit they were stupid, most people realise that, there's not so much method in the madness, it's just a lot of madness without method. And so just by association, I think Dutton is starting to lose a bit of paint, even though he doesn't actually court that association. The third impact of Trump on our election is the injection of national security, whether it's his abandonment of Ukraine and his inadvertent or otherwise embrace of Putin, the whole fracturing of the Western alliance. So it's brought all these things in, and I don't think security will be a front and centre issue, but it will be a big issue. The last really big national security election in terms of global terms was the 2001. As we know, that was held in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and Howard played that perfectly and won handsomely. The difference was back then that was all the way with Uncle Sam. That was an all the way with the USA type election about the alliance. We'd just invoked the ANZUS Treaty in response to 9/11, and it was a sort of race to, who could keep Australia safer, Labor or Liberal. This one, I think, is a lot more awkward for both of the major parties because they know the US alliance is still very important despite the madness in the White House, and at the same time, public support for that alliance is waning, or at least people are asking questions.
John, there's also the economic impact of Trump, and that's already being felt in Australia following last week's imposition of tariffs on our steel and aluminium exports. How is Trump's erratic policymaking affecting the global and domestic economic outlook, and what does that mean for the budget and for the election campaign?
Well, there's no doubt Trump's tariffs, not just on Australia but more generally across the world, are adding to a lot of uncertainty in terms of business investment decision-making. That's not good for growth. It's obviously hitting share markets as well, which will affect how much capital gains tax superannuation funds and individuals will pay as well. So, look, at the same time, I don't know it's going to have a massive impact on the budget in the short term until we get a bit more clarification of what's actually going on. I think Jim Chalmers is going to try and talk up the impact of it, the uncertainty on the economy, on the budget. That'll certainly be one of the key strands and themes, and saying stick with us during these times of uncertainty.
And this is a new world of uncertainty to make our economy more resilient at a time of very serious global economic uncertainty. The Australian economy is performing quite well.
The real uncertainty is what happens to the trade war more broadly between the United States and China and other big economies around the world, because the real impact on Australia is not so much the direct impact of these relatively minor tariffs on steel and aluminium. That's only 0.2% of our exports. There could be future tariffs coming on things like beef and pharmaceuticals from the US as well. Even that's not going to have a major direct impact on our economy. It's unhelpful. But the bigger impact is if, the US gets in a tit-for-tat escalating trade war to China, we send 40% of our exports there, we sell a lot of iron ore, coal, gas, agriculture. If suddenly China's economy is hit hard by a US trade war, that means they could reduce demand for all those products they buy from Australia. But there's a lot of uncertainty around this, because even the counterfactual of that is, if China's economy gets hit by a Trump trade war, they may unleash a stimulus, and historically that has been good for our resources sector as well.
So traditionally, uncertainty, instability has always favoured the incumbent. If you go back to 2001, John Howard's unofficial election slogan was "In these uncertain times." That was in the wake of 9/11. So based on historical precedent, you'd have to think the volatility in the world at the moment, which is being precipitated by Trump, would have to favour the incumbent, in this case the Albanese government.
And just on the budget, John, apart from Labor's economic narrative, what are you looking for in the budget papers? Will the focus be on the economic and budget forecasts, the deficits? Will we get an update on the NDIS? What's the first page you're going to turn to?
Yeah, look, the first page I typically turn to during the budget lockup of journalists is before it's publicly released. We normally get it in the early afternoon and it comes out around 7:30 p.m. is what's known as the reconciliation table and also the Treasurer's speech. So the speech gives you a quick overview of what the main economic and political emphases are in the budget. So that just gives you a quick overview. But then the reconciliation table, that sort of nets out all the government's spending decisions. How much extra are they spending in net terms? How much extra tax revenue are they collecting? And that really gives you a sort of perspective, how much more is the economy because of high commodity prices or low unemployment, delivering the government's budget in terms of extra revenue, lower spending on jobless welfare benefits, and how much is actually the government, through its own discretionary spending decisions, injecting into the economy more as well, particularly around elections times where they obviously want to spend on popular programs. In terms of the NDIS, it's up to about $49 billion this year. I note the government says it's going to be about $700 million under budget, which in the grand scheme of the cost overruns we've had of, worth tens of billions of dollars cumulatively over the past few years is really a drop in the ocean. It's still projected to grow at more than 10% this year. That's down from growth of over 20% last year, but it's still running at phenomenally high rates. And so the idea that it's under control or they've fixed this thing is really a fantasy. And I think harder decisions are going to need to be made after this election on trying to rein in the cost of it.
A final couple of questions for both of you. This might be the budget that no one wanted, but it's happening. So who will it advantage or disadvantage? And we're not in an official campaign yet, but what's your early call on what the result might be?
I think it's too early to say who the budget will disadvantage and advantage. Clearly the government, as 2 weeks ago, was of the belief that handing down a budget would disadvantage it. That's why they decided to go to the election on April 12 and not do a budget. So they have to turn this into a document that now will advantage them. So I guess just based on that, you'd have to say they're starting with a handicap. But having said that, most people out there don't care anymore about debt and deficit, but it is important. And one of Labor's big lines, the ones I've been running now for a good 6 months, is we turned Liberal deficits into Labor surpluses. Well, there's no denying now they've turned Labor surpluses into Labor deficits. So how they've managed to put a spin on that, we shall see. And as we said earlier in the podcast, Lisa, Dutton gets a free hit on the Thursday night. But look, the previous 3 elections have been held in May or early, and they've all had early budgets held in late March or early April. And I don't think those budgets have had much of an effect on the outcome either way, except possibly 2019 when Scott Morrison pulled off the unwinnable win and announced all the stage 1, 2, 3 tax cuts before that. But there's a much different vibe around this one. And as to what the result might be, I find it hard to see how Labor will not be in power after the next election, either a majority or minority, just based on the raw seat count. It's just so hard for the coalition to win the number of seats it needs to win, even to form minority, let alone majority. And based on that and nothing more than that, as well as the history, we haven't had a one-term government since 1931. If I was to have a bet, and I'm not allowed to, I'd say Labor minority, but I'm not ruling out a Labor majority either.
I think this budget contains potential rewards and risks for Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer. If Labor's able to capitalise on this, get a bit of a rebound, get a bit of momentum heading to the election, and they hold on to government, that's going to look pretty good for him after the election, particularly given that there's a school of thought out there that he may be the next successor to Anthony Albanese. But if it flops, if this budget doesn't go down well, if Labor somehow lose the election, or not even lose but do very badly and go deep into minority government, then maybe he doesn't look so good. For the opposition, I think they need to start to roll out some policies on the economic front, starting with Dutton's speech on the Thursday night response. There's a little bit of discontent within the backbenchers of the Liberal Party, particularly on the moderate side, and let's not forget Dutton and Taylor are both Conservatives. They want to see a bit bolder economic policy, better communication of it, taking the fight up to Jim Chalmers. So I think there's something in this budget for both sides, but also risks as well. In terms of the election result, look, up until 2 or 3 weeks ago, I thought this was a nail-biter. And it still could be very close. I was almost thinking, gee, Dutton's got the momentum. Labor just haven't been able to find a circuit breaker. And if you followed the trends, it was almost feeling like Liberal minority was a reasonable chance. But now, after a couple of bad weeks for the coalition, Albanese looking a little bit prime ministerial after the ex-cyclone Alfred, I'm sort of leaning back towards minority government for Labor, but there's a lot of water to go under the bridge. I still think it's very close to call. It's going to depend on how both sides campaign. But minority government seems to be the tip in either direction. It's just a matter of which party can cobble together the numbers in the House of Representatives. to get that magic 75 or 76 seats.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, John.
No worries, Lise.
Good to be with you.
And Phil, looking forward to our political panel once the federal election campaign kicks off. The weekly podcast Election 2025 will be out every Tuesday. John, I hope you'll join us to give us your perspective on the big economic issues.
Look forward to it, Lisa.
Can't wait to be back.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with the Financial Review's political editor, Philip Curry, and economics editor, John Keogh, reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow. Lap Fan is head of podcast. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. And just a heads up, once the federal election campaign kicks off, The Fin will be releasing a special weekly podcast. Every Tuesday, I'll be joined by Phil Curry and our other Canberra experts to break down the big issues. If you want to be ahead of the game, send us in your questions for the political panel. Email thefin@afr.com. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.